The strangest thing was not what she did to the dog. It was the way the quiet man looked at her afterward. Snow drifted slowly through the mountain town of Silver Creek, Colorado, covering sidewalks in soft white layers while expensive storefront windows reflected warm golden light against the cold evening sky. December always arrived beautifully here. Tourists called it magical. Locals called it predictable. Wealth moved quietly through Silver Creek in polished SUVs, expensive winter coats, and conversations that sounded warm while meaning very little. But beneath all that polished comfort, loneliness still found ways to live. Daniel Brooks understood that better than most. He stood outside a small hardware store near Main Street, carrying an old paper bag filled with furnace filters and motor oil, shoulders dusted lightly with snow, while Shadow walked patiently beside him. The German Shepherd moved calmly despite the busy sidewalks, black and tan fur bright against winter snow, intelligent amber eyes quietly watching everything. Shadow never pulled the leash, never barked unnecessarily. Years ago, discipline became instinct for him. Daniel preferred it that way. Quiet understood quiet. At 47, Daniel had grown comfortable becoming invisible. He worked maintenance jobs around town, fixed broken heaters, repaired fences before storms arrived, sometimes helped older neighbors shovel driveways if snow came too hard overnight. Most people knew him simply as the quiet man near Pine Ridge Road who lived alone in the small cabin overlooking the woods. Few asked questions. Daniel rarely offered answers. Some silences felt earned after enough years. Since losing his wife, Emily, nearly 5 winters ago, life narrowed into routines simple enough not to hurt too much. Morning coffee before sunrise. Work until evening. Quiet dinners shared only with Shadow. One untouched chair remaining beside the kitchen table because moving it somehow felt too permanent. Grief settled strangely when enough time passed. Softer, quieter, never really gone. Shadow slowed suddenly near Whitmore Cafe, an upscale place overlooking the snowy town square where tourists gathered for expensive coffee and photographs beside glowing Christmas decorations. Daniel barely noticed at first. The shepherd had paused near the outdoor patio where a young child sat wrapped in an oversized winter coat, quietly crying while her exhausted mother searched through spilled shopping bags nearby. Shadow glanced toward Daniel briefly. Daniel understood immediately. "Easy," he said softly. The dog stepped calmly closer toward the edge of the patio, tail relaxed, posture gentle. The little girl noticed first. Her crying slowed almost instantly. Tiny mitten-covered hands reached carefully toward Shadow. "Puppy," she whispered through hiccuping tears. Shadow lowered himself calmly, patient as always around children. The girl smiled for the first time in several minutes. Then everything changed. "Excuse me." The voice arrived sharp enough to cut through cold air. Several people turned immediately. A woman stood near the cafe entrance wrapped in an expensive cream-colored coat, dark sunglasses resting atop carefully styled hair despite the cloudy weather. Elegant gloves, jewelry that caught every bit of winter light. The kind of confidence money sometimes built too carefully. Margaret Whitmore rarely repeated herself. Owner of several luxury properties across town. Wealthy, influential, respected depending on who needed something from her. She looked toward Shadow with immediate irritation. "Whose dog is this?" Daniel stepped forward calmly. "Mine." Margaret frowned sharply. This animal should not be near people. The word landed strangely. Animal. Cold. Detached. Daniel kept his voice even. "He is trained." "That does not matter," she replied quickly. "A dog that sighs around children is irresponsible." The little girl looked confused now, one small hand still resting gently against Shadow's fur. "He is nice," she whispered softly. Margaret barely noticed. "Remove him immediately." Daniel glanced once toward Shadow. Calm. Steady. No tension. No danger. Just patience. Yet people nearby had already started watching, whispering quietly the way small wealthy towns always did. Somebody filming with a phone near the cafe window. Daniel exhaled slowly through cold air. "He was helping," he said quietly. Margaret crossed her arms. "Helping." Her voice sharpened. "That animal frightened customers." Then, before Daniel could answer, she stepped too quickly toward the dog, reaching abruptly toward Shadow's collar with irritation instead of care. Shadow instinctively stepped backward, startled more than defensive. The sudden movement caused the little girl to cry again. Daniel moved forward immediately. Calm. Controlled. Please do not grab him like that. Margaret turned sharply toward him. Then control your dog. Silence settled strangely across the patio. Snow continued falling softly while warm cafe lights glowed behind expensive glass windows. Daniel looked at Margaret for several long seconds. No anger. No raised voice. No argument. Just disappointment, so quiet it almost felt heavier. Then he crouched beside Shadow, resting one steady hand gently against the shepherd's shoulder. Come on, buddy, he said softly. We are leaving. Shadow stood calmly beside him immediately. Loyal as breathing. Margaret shook her head with visible frustration. Some people should not own animals that dangerous. Daniel paused. For half a second, something unreadable crossed his face. Sadness maybe. Weariness too. But not anger. Never anger. When he finally looked at her again, his voice stayed quiet enough people leaned slightly closer just to hear it. Funny thing, he said gently. Most harm does not come from the ones people fear. Then he turned away. No argument. No scene. Just snow falling softly around a quiet man, and the dog walking faithfully beside him, while something strangely unsettled stayed behind in the cold air between them. The quietest people often carry the heaviest stories, and sometimes the strongest hearts are the ones nobody notices at first. Snow followed Daniel Brooks all the way home that evening, drifting gently across the winding road toward Pine Ridge, while mountain shadows settled over Silver Creek like an old familiar blanket. Shadow sat quietly in the passenger seat of Daniel's aging pickup truck, calm despite everything that happened outside Whitmore Cafe. The German shepherd rested his head near the window, watching snowy pine trees blur past in silence. Daniel glanced toward him once at a red light near the edge of town. You did nothing wrong, he said softly. Shadow's ears lifted slightly. The dog understood tone more than words. Daniel smiled faintly, tired around the edges. Still handled that better than most people. The truck continued climbing toward the cabin. Daniel never liked town much, especially during tourist season when Silver Creek filled with expensive coats and louder opinions. People came here searching for peaceful mountain charm, though most never noticed the people quietly holding the town together. The mechanics, the snowplow drivers, the repairmen fixing broken heaters at midnight while vacation homes stayed warm. Daniel belonged to the invisible side of Silver Creek. Truthfully, he preferred it. His cabin sat nearly 3 miles outside town, tucked between tall pine trees overlooking a frozen valley where winter wind moved softly through the mountains. Small place, weathered wood siding, old porch swing untouched for years. Warm enough when the fireplace behaved. Home, even if grief still echoed quietly through the walls. Shadow jumped from the truck first after Daniel parked near the porch, paws crunching lightly through fresh snow. Daniel carried groceries inside, while warm air slowly replaced the cold in the small kitchen. Same routine as always. Boots near the door. Firewood stacked beside the stone fireplace. One coffee mug drying near the sink. One chair always left untouched beside the dining table. Emily's chair. Daniel paused there briefly before setting groceries away. Some habits stayed, even when time moved on. Loss changed shape. It never disappeared completely. Shadow wandered toward the living room before settling near the fireplace, though something felt different tonight. Restless. The dog kept glancing toward the window facing town. Watching. Listening. Daniel noticed immediately. What is going on with you? He asked softly. Shadow looked back, tail barely moving before returning attention toward the dark outside. Strange. Usually evenings felt peaceful here. Dinner. Firelight. Quiet radio humming softly in the background. But tonight the dog stayed alert. Almost distracted. Daniel rubbed tired hands together before starting coffee despite the late hour. Some nights called for warmth more than sleep. His phone buzzed unexpectedly near the counter. Rare enough to feel strange. Daniel frowned at the screen. Local maintenance company. Voicemail. He pressed play quietly. Daniel, this is Carl over at Summit Property Services. A pause followed. Tone awkward. Hesitant. Look, I hate this, but Mrs. Whitmore made some calls after what happened downtown. We are going another direction on winter maintenance for the lodge properties. Silence. Then, sorry, buddy. Daniel stood still for several seconds. Snow tapped lightly against the kitchen window. He already understood. Margaret Whitmore owned nearly half the luxury vacation properties surrounding town. If she wanted somebody gone quietly, business usually listened. Daniel set the phone down without anger. Just tired disappointment settling somewhere familiar. Enough years passed, and life taught strange lessons. Sometimes unfairness arrived wearing expensive gloves and polite smiles. Shadow crossed the room immediately, resting his head gently against Daniel's hand. Like he already knew, Daniel scratched behind the shepherd's ear absent-mindedly. "Looks like we might be eating cheaper dinners for a while," he muttered quietly. Shadow remained close, loyal as breathing. That loyalty always surprised Daniel, even after all these years. The truth was, Shadow saved him more than once. Not dramatically, quietly. The kind of saving that happened in empty rooms after funerals, during sleepless nights when grief sat too heavily against the chest. After Emily passed, Daniel nearly disappeared into silence completely. Shadow simply stayed. Every morning, every bad night, every winter storm. Sometimes healing arrived without speeches. Sometimes it arrived on four paws and refused to leave. Later that evening, Daniel sat beside the fireplace holding a coffee mug gone mostly cold while Shadow rested nearby. The cabin stayed quiet except for soft wind against the roof. Somewhere far below, town lights glowed faintly between snowfall and pine trees. Daniel thought about Margaret Whitmore again. Not angrily, just confused. Something about the way she looked at Shadow bothered him. Not fear exactly, more like distance, as if kindness itself felt unfamiliar. Shadow suddenly stood, moved toward the front door again. Waiting, watching. Daniel frowned. "Buddy, nobody is coming." But Shadow stayed there anyway. Alert, patient, like he sensed something still unfinished. Daniel exhaled slowly, rubbing one tired hand across his face before glancing toward the quiet cabin around him. Funny how loneliness worked. You could spend years learning silence only to realize eventually silence learned you too. And if stories like this mean something to you, maybe take a moment to like and subscribe so you do not miss more unforgettable journeys still waiting ahead. Outside, snow continued falling gently over Silver Creek, while somewhere below town lights flickered softly against the winter night. And for reasons Daniel could not yet understand, Shadow refused to stop watching the road leading back toward the woman who had treated him coldly only hours earlier. The strange thing about loneliness is that sometimes it recognizes another lonely thing long before people ever do. Morning arrived quietly over Silver Creek, pale winter sunlight stretching across snow-covered rooftops while frost settled thick against windows and pine branches. The town looked beautiful from a distance. Peaceful, expensive, untouched. But beauty had a strange way of hiding difficult things. Daniel Brooks stood near the back entrance of a small hardware warehouse just after sunrise, tightening the straps on an old toolbox before loading supplies into his truck. The cold bit harder this morning, sharp enough to sting through gloves, but mountain winters never bothered him much. Routine made weather easier. Work usually did too. Usually. Carl Morgan stood nearby, shifting awkwardly beside stacked bags of road salt, hands buried deep inside his coat pockets. "I really am sorry about the lodge contracts," he said quietly. Daniel nodded once. "Calm as always." "You already said that." Carl looked uncomfortable. "Margaret Whitmore called personally." He lowered his voice. "People listen when she talks around here." Daniel closed the truck door gently. No anger, no frustration, just quiet acceptance. It is fine. But it was not really fine. They both knew it. Losing the Whitmore Lodge properties meant losing nearly 40% of Daniel's winter maintenance income. Enough to matter. Enough to make hard months harder. Carl rubbed one hand across his beard. Could try talking to her. Daniel shook his head immediately. "No, Daniel. People only change their minds when they want to," he said quietly. "Not because somebody asks." That answer stayed with Carl after Daniel drove away. Because the strange thing about Daniel Brooks was how calm he remained even when life gave him reasons not to. No bitterness. No complaints. Just silence heavy enough to feel older than it looked. Back at the cabin, Shadow waited near the porch exactly where Daniel left him. The German shepherd stood immediately when the truck arrived, tail moving once before pacing toward the passenger side door. Daniel crouched slightly near him. "You ready for breakfast?" But Shadow barely looked toward the house. Instead, the dog turned his attention toward the road leading back toward town again. Alert, watching, waiting. Daniel frowned softly. Still thinking about yesterday? Shadow moved toward the edge of the driveway, ears slightly raised against the winter wind. Strange behavior. The shepherd usually settled after breakfast, especially on cold mornings. But something remained unsettled inside him. Daniel noticed it more now. Restlessness. Attention always drifting south towards Silver Creek. Like the dog expected something unfinished. Inside the cabin, breakfast passed quietly. Eggs, toast, black coffee. Daniel fixed Shadow's food near the fireplace before sitting near the kitchen window overlooking frozen woods. Snow drifted softly through tall pine trees while silence wrapped around the cabin like it always did. Yet even now, Shadow stayed near the front door. Waiting. Watching. Daniel sighed quietly. You are acting like somebody forgot something. Shadow turned briefly before returning attention outside. By late afternoon, Daniel found himself back in town repairing a broken heating system at a small bookstore near Main Street. Older woman named Ruth Parker owned the place. Kind eyes. Soft voice. The kind of person who noticed when somebody seemed tired without asking too many questions. Heard about Whitmore, she said gently while handing Daniel coffee near the register. Daniel glanced up briefly. Small towns worked fast. News travels. Ruth nodded sadly. Faster when rich people are involved. Daniel gave the faintest tired smile. Guess so. She leaned against the counter. For what it is worth, everybody saw what happened yesterday. Daniel paused. Everybody. Ruth nodded. People know Shadow did nothing wrong. That surprised him slightly. Not enough to matter maybe, but enough to notice. Sometimes, Ruth added quietly, people mistake fear for authority. Daniel looked toward the snowy street outside. Something about that sentence stayed with him longer than expected. Meanwhile, across town, Margaret Whitmore stood inside her massive hillside home overlooking Silver Creek, staring absently through tall windows toward the frozen valley below. Expensive silence filled the house. Perfect furniture. Perfect decorations. Too much space. Not enough warmth. Her assistant had already canceled 2 meetings after noticing her strange mood. Margaret rarely distracted easily, yet today felt unsettled. She kept replaying yesterday in uncomfortable fragments. The child smiling at the dog. The quiet man's calm voice. The way disappointment crossed his face instead of anger. Somehow, disappointment felt worse. Much worse. She moved toward the kitchen, pouring untouched tea she no longer wanted. Then paused suddenly. Outside near the lower edge of her property, movement shifted through snowfall. A dog. Large. Calm. Sitting perfectly still near the gate. Watching the house. The same German shepherd. Shadow remained there quietly. No aggression. No barking. No threat. Just waiting. Patient as snowfall itself. Margaret frowned immediately. What on earth? Yet something strange happened then. For reasons she could not explain, instead of fear, an unfamiliar feeling settled quietly beneath her ribs. Loneliness. The kind she usually ignored too quickly. And somehow, impossibly, the dog seemed to understand it. Snowstorms had a strange way of revealing who people really were. By late evening, Silver Creek disappeared beneath thick mountain snowfall, the kind that swallowed roads quietly and turned familiar places unfamiliar in less than an hour. Wind curled through pine trees outside Daniel Brooks's cabin, while warm firelight flickered softly across wooden walls inside. Shadow had not settled once all day. Restless. Watching. Pacing between the front window and the door as though waiting for instructions nobody else could hear. Daniel noticed it immediately. You were still thinking about that woman? He asked softly while adding wood to the fireplace. Shadow stood near the front door, ears alert toward the storm outside. Tail still. Focused. Daniel frowned slightly. Buddy, she made her choice. But the shepherd remained unmoving. Patient. Persistent. Like something deep inside him refused to let go. Outside, snow piled heavily across mountain roads leading toward the wealthy ridge homes overlooking town. Most residents stayed safely inside tonight. But Margaret Whitmore was not most residents. Her luxury SUV moved carefully along Ridgeview Pass, headlights barely cutting through thick snowfall, while icy wind shook the vehicle harder with every mile. She hated driving herself, hated storms even more. But after an exhausting meeting in Denver, returning home felt necessary. Familiarity usually made loneliness easier to ignore. Tonight, however, nothing felt familiar. Her hands tightened against the steering wheel as visibility worsened. Wind rattled sharply across glass. Tires slipped once against hidden ice. Then again. Come on, she muttered quietly beneath her breath. The road narrowed sharply near a wooded overlook just outside town. One wrong turn here, meant hours waiting for help nobody promised would come quickly during mountain weather. Then suddenly, without warning, the SUV jerked hard sideways. Tires spun uselessly. A low mechanical sound followed. Silence. Margaret sat frozen for several seconds while snow battered the windshield. She tried the ignition again. Nothing. Again. Still nothing. Cell signal weak. Barely working. The temperature inside the vehicle already beginning to drop. For the first time in longer than she wanted to admit, fear arrived quietly. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just uncomfortable enough to settle beneath the ribs. Somewhere across town, Shadow suddenly stood upright near the cabin door. Fully alert now. Daniel looked up immediately. What is it? The shepherd moved closer. Restless. Focused. Daniel opened the front door briefly. Cold wind rushed inside instantly. Snow blowing hard enough to sting. Shadow stepped forward into the storm before turning back once. Waiting. Daniel narrowed his eyes. Strange. Very strange. No, he muttered quietly. Absolutely not. But Shadow stepped farther into the snow, then looked back again. Waiting. Patient. Intentional. Daniel sighed softly beneath his breath. 5 years together taught him one thing. Shadow only acted like this when something mattered. Deeply mattered. 20 minutes later, Daniel's truck pushed carefully through icy mountain roads while snow drifted hard across dark pavement. Shadow sat alert in the passenger seat, staring ahead like he somehow knew exactly where they were going. Daniel glanced toward him once. You better have a reason for this. The dog remained still. Calm. Certain. Ridgeview Pass appeared nearly invisible through the storm. Wind screamed through pine trees while thick snow buried road signs almost completely. Then Shadow shifted suddenly, posture tightening. Daniel slowed immediately. Headlights caught something ahead. A dark SUV partially buried against the roadside embankment. Hazard lights blinking weakly through snow. Daniel parked carefully several yards away and stepped out into brutal cold. Wind pushed hard against his coat while snow crunched beneath boots. He moved closer slowly. Through the frosted driver's side window, he froze. Margaret Whitmore sat inside wrapped tightly in her coat, hands trembling slightly against the steering wheel. Her expression shifted instantly when she looked up. Confusion first, then recognition, then something harder to explain. Embarrassment maybe. Daniel tapped gently against the window. Calm. No frustration. No judgment. Just quiet concern. She lowered the window slightly. Cold air rushed inside immediately. You? She asked softly, almost unable to believe it. Snow gathered quickly across Daniel's shoulders. Looks like you could use some help. Margaret hesitated. Pride moved visibly across her face before reality finally interrupted it. My car stopped, she admitted quietly. Signal barely works. Daniel nodded once. Already kneeling near the tires despite freezing wind. You should stay warm. Shadow appeared beside him moments later, calm despite heavy snowfall. Margaret looked toward the shepherd uncertainly through the glass. Yet somehow, impossibly, he no longer looked dangerous. Just concerned. Patient. Loyal. Daniel opened the passenger door briefly. He found you, he said simply. Margaret blinked. Found me. Daniel glanced toward Shadow. Been restless since yesterday. Snow drifted heavily around them, while silence settled strangely inside the storm. Margaret looked between the man she embarrassed and the dog she misunderstood. Something uncomfortable tightened quietly inside her chest. Because somehow, on the coldest night of winter, the only person who came looking for her was the quiet man she had treated unfairly, and the dog she never should have judged. Kindness becomes hardest exactly when life gives us every reason not to offer it. Snow continued falling across Ridgeview Pass while Daniel Brooks worked quietly beneath the hood of Margaret Whitmore's stalled SUV. Cold wind moving hard through pine trees surrounding the narrow mountain road. The storm had grown heavier now, thick enough to blur visibility beyond a few yards. Shadow stood nearby, calm despite the weather, black and tan fur dusted with snow, while watchful amber eyes moved carefully between Daniel and Margaret like he understood something neither of them fully saw yet. Margaret remained inside the vehicle for several minutes at first, hands wrapped tightly around herself, while warmth slowly disappeared from the cabin. She watched through the windshield as Daniel worked without complaint. No frustration, no lecture, no reminder of what happened outside the cafe. just quiet effort beneath freezing wind. Somehow, that unsettled her more than anger ever could. Most people wanted something eventually. Recognition, revenge, apologies. Daniel asked for nothing. After several minutes, he stepped back from the engine and tapped gently against the driver's side window again. Margaret lowered it slightly. Cold air rushed inside. Fuel line froze, Daniel said calmly. Storm hit harder than forecast. Margaret hesitated. Can you fix it? Daniel looked toward the sky briefly. Snow falling faster now. Not safely here. He nodded toward his truck parked behind them. Road conditions are getting worse. Margaret tightened her jaw slightly. Pride arrived immediately, familiar and automatic. I can wait for roadside service. Daniel said nothing for a second, then glanced once toward the barely functioning signal bars on her dashboard. Maybe, he said quietly, but it could be hours. Wind rattled sharply against the SUV again. The mountain road suddenly felt much lonelier than before. Shadow moved closer to the door then, calm as ever. Margaret looked at him carefully now. Different this time. Not fear. Curiosity maybe. The shepherd sat patiently in snow near her door, posture relaxed despite cold weather. Loyal enough to stay beside the man who had every reason to leave her behind. Daniel exhaled softly. There is a ranger station about 12 miles down, he said. Could wait there until morning. Margaret looked down briefly. I do not like relying on people. The honesty surprised even her. Daniel almost smiled. Small. Tired. Familiar somehow. Nobody does. Silence settled quietly between them while snowfall thickened around the road. Finally, Margaret nodded once. All right. Daniel simply stepped back toward his truck like the decision did not require gratitude. No performance. No heroics. Just practicality wrapped inside quiet decency. 20 minutes later, warmth slowly returned inside Daniel's old pickup truck while tires pushed carefully through worsening roads. Shadow rested calmly between them on the bench seat, somehow taking up just enough space to remind both people they were not alone. Margaret sat stiffly near the passenger window at first, elegant coat wrapped tightly despite the heater running hard. Wolf had taught her control, distance, comfort. Yet somehow, tonight, sitting inside an aging truck beside a quiet mechanic felt strangely more human than the polished silence waiting inside her massive house. Daniel drove carefully through heavy snow, hands steady against the steering wheel. No music, just wind moving outside and soft engine sounds filling the quiet. Finally, Margaret looked toward Shadow. He really came looking for me? Daniel nodded once. Would not settle all day. She frowned slightly. After what happened, Daniel glanced briefly toward the road. Shadow tends to see people differently. Margaret lowered her eyes toward the dog. Shadow rested quietly, head leaning gently against the seat as though the entire situation made perfect sense to him. I was unfair, she admitted softly after a while. The words sounded unfamiliar in her voice. Daniel remained quiet long enough that she almost wondered if he heard her. Then finally he spoke. Fear makes people do strange things. That surprised her. No blame. No bitterness. Somehow forgiveness felt harder to sit with than anger. The ranger station sat dark when they finally arrived, temporary closure signs buried partly beneath snowdrifts. Daniel frowned slightly. That is not good. Margaret looked around uneasily. Wind moved harder now. Visibility nearly gone. Daniel thought for a second before speaking again. My cabin is closer. She turned toward him immediately. Your cabin? He nodded calmly. Until roads clear. Margaret hesitated. Everything about her life told her to say no. Yet storms had strange ways of stripping comfort down to truth. Outside, mountains disappeared beneath darkness and snow. Inside the truck sat the same man she embarrassed publicly and the same dog she wrongly judged. Somehow they still stayed. Still helped. Shadow lifted his head then, looking toward her quietly. Patiently. Like the choice already mattered somehow. Margaret exhaled slowly. All right, she said softly. Daniel simply nodded once before pulling back onto the road. No victory in his expression. No satisfaction. Just quiet responsibility. And somewhere deep beneath layers of pride she spent years building carefully, Margaret Whitmore began feeling something unfamiliar. Not guilt exactly. Something softer. Lonelier. Like maybe the quiet man beside her understood something about broken things she had spent too long pretending did not exist. Storms have a strange way of shrinking the distance between strangers, especially the ones carrying more loneliness than they ever admit out loud. Snow followed Daniel Brooks all the way back to Pine Ridge, thick enough now to swallow road signs and soften every familiar shape into something quieter. The truck climbed slowly through the dark mountain road while warm air filled the cabin in soft, uneven waves. Shadow rested peacefully between them, one paw stretched slightly toward Margaret Whitmore, as though making silent peace long before either human fully understood how. Margaret noticed it after several miles. "He trusts people quickly," she said quietly, eyes lowering toward the German shepherd. Daniel glanced once before returning attention to the road. "Not really." She looked surprised. "No." Daniel shook his head slightly. Shadow usually knows who needs patience. Something about that answer unsettled her again. Not because it sounded dramatic, because it sounded honest. Outside, snow moved endlessly through headlights while the mountains disappeared beneath winter darkness. For the first time in years, Margaret found herself sitting inside silence that did not feel performative. No assistant filling quiet spaces. No business calls. No carefully polite conversations over expensive dinners. Just wind. Snow. A quiet man she misunderstood, and a dog somehow kinder than she deserved. Daniel's cabin finally appeared through the trees nearly 40 minutes later, warm porch light glowing softly against falling snow. Small. Weathered. Honest. Nothing about it looked impressive, yet somehow it felt steadier than most homes Margaret visited. Daniel parked near the porch and stepped into the storm first, quickly helping open the passenger door before cold rushed against them. Shadow jumped down immediately and trotted toward the front steps like he had finally accomplished something important. Inside, warmth wrapped around them slowly. Fire still glowed softly inside the stone fireplace while cedarwood scent drifted quietly through the cabin. Margaret stood near the doorway for several seconds, brushing snow from her coat while silently studying the room. Old wooden shelves, work boots near the door, family photographs. A life simple enough to feel real. Not curated. Not polished. Real. Daniel moved toward the kitchen without ceremony. "Coffee." Margaret hesitated. "Please." He nodded once before disappearing briefly toward the small kitchen. Shadow settled immediately near the fireplace, stretching comfortably across the rug before glancing up at Margaret. Calm. Familiar now somehow. Like her presence no longer required explanation. Margaret cautiously sat near the edge of an old chair while snow tapped gently against windows. Something about the quiet felt uncomfortable at first, then strangely peaceful. Daniel returned moments later carrying 2 steaming mugs before setting one carefully near her. "Nothing fancy," he said quietly. "That sounds nice," she admitted. The honesty surprised them both. Silence settled softly between them while firelight flickered against cabin walls. Margaret's attention drifted toward framed photographs resting on a nearby shelf. One picture caught her attention immediately. Daniel standing beside a smiling woman wrapped in a winter scarf, Shadow younger than, sitting proudly beside them. Happiness looked different in photographs before grief arrived. "Your wife?" Margaret asked gently. Daniel glanced toward the picture for a second. "Emily." His voice softened almost invisibly. "Past 5 years ago." Margaret lowered her eyes immediately. "I am sorry." Daniel nodded once. No dramatics. No discomfort. Just truth sitting quietly where grief learned to stay. "Heart condition," he said after a moment. "Fast." The fire cracked softly between them. Margaret wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "I suppose," she stopped herself briefly. Strange how vulnerability felt harder than authority. "I suppose people think wealth protects loneliness." Daniel almost smiled. Small. Tired. Understanding. "Does it?" Margaret looked toward the dark window. Snow covering everything outside. "No," she said quietly. "Just hides it better." That answer lingered in the room longer than either expected. Shadow stood suddenly, then and crossed toward Margaret without hesitation. Calm. Slow. Deliberate. The German shepherd rested his head gently against her knee. Margaret froze slightly. "He does not usually." Daniel stopped, then smiled faintly. "Actually, maybe he does." She looked down at Shadow carefully, fingers hesitating before slowly brushing across warm fur. No fear now. No distance. Just quiet surprise. "After what I did yesterday," she whispered softly, almost embarrassed. "Why would he still trust me?" Daniel stared quietly into the fireplace before answering. "Dogs are better at forgiveness than people." Snow moved gently outside, while warmth slowly replaced the cold they carried in with them. Somewhere inside herself, something long guarded began softening in ways Margaret did not fully understand yet. Then her attention drifted toward another photograph partially tucked near the bookshelf. A framed image of younger men standing near ocean water beside military equipment. Daniel looked different there. Stronger somehow. Harder. Focused in a way life outside uniform rarely allowed. Margaret frowned slightly. "You served?" she asked quietly. Daniel paused for just half a second before taking another sip of coffee. "Long time ago." Simple answer. Calm. Yet something in his posture shifted almost invisibly. Not avoidance exactly. More like memory arriving uninvited. Margaret looked again toward the photograph. Something about the image stayed with her longer than expected. Because for the first time since meeting him, she realized something quietly uncomfortable. She knew almost nothing about the man whose kindness had just carried her safely through a storm after she had given him every reason not to help. Some truths stay hidden not because people are dishonest, but because pain teaches them silence. Snow continued falling outside Daniel Brooks's cabin long after midnight, soft enough now to turn the mountain woods into something quiet and almost unreal. Inside, firelight flickered gently against old wooden walls while warmth slowly softened the sharp edges of the storm. Margaret Whitmore sat near the fireplace holding a second cup of coffee she barely touched, watching Shadow sleep peacefully near her feet like he had known her longer than a single difficult evening. Strange how trust worked sometimes. Earned slowly, given unexpectedly. Daniel moved quietly around the kitchen, gathering extra blankets without much ceremony. "Guest room is down the hall," he said calmly. "Not much to look at, but warm." Margaret looked up immediately. "You are serious?" Daniel glanced toward the storm outside. "Roads are worse now." She hesitated. Most of her life, accepting help felt uncomfortable, especially from people she once stood above too quickly. Yet tonight had stripped away something pride usually protected. "Thank you," she said quietly. Daniel nodded once like gratitude embarrassed him slightly. "Get some rest." Later that night, Margaret stood alone in the small guest room overlooking dark pine trees dusted in snow. The room felt simple, honest. Handmade quilt folded neatly near the bed. Old bookshelf beside the window. Small lamp glowing softly against cedar walls. No luxury. Yet somehow it felt warmer than most expensive hotel suites she stayed in. Real warmth. The kind money never figured out how to buy. Sleep did not arrive easily. Not because of discomfort. Because memory finally stopped hiding behind noise. She thought about the little girl outside Whitmore Cafe. Shadow calming her without hesitation. Daniel staying calm even after humiliation. The disappointment in his eyes instead of anger. Somehow disappointment felt impossible to forget. Near 2 a.m, Margaret quietly stepped into the hallway for water. Soft firelight still glowed faintly from the living room. She paused. Daniel sat alone near the fireplace, staring quietly into fading flames while Shadow rested nearby. Neither seemed surprised by silence anymore. Margaret almost turned back before Daniel glanced up briefly. "Could not sleep?" he asked softly. She hesitated. "No." Daniel motioned lightly toward the chair nearby. "Fire helps." After a second, she sat. Snow drifted quietly beyond dark windows while warmth wrapped around the room. Neither spoke for several minutes. Somehow silence felt easier here. Finally, Margaret looked toward the framed military photograph again resting near the bookshelf. Younger faces. Ocean behind them. Discipline written into posture. "You never answered earlier," she said gently. "About serving." Daniel stared into the fire for a long moment before responding. "Navy." Simple answer. Quiet. Margaret nodded slowly. That explained Shadow. Daniel glanced toward the sleeping shepherd. "He served too." That caught her attention immediately. "Military dog." Daniel nodded once. "Retired after deployment injuries." Margaret looked toward Shadow differently now. The calm patience. The discipline. The way he watched people carefully. Suddenly, pieces made more sense. "He still came looking for me," she whispered quietly. Daniel almost smiled faintly. "That sounds like him." Silence settled again before Margaret finally asked the question sitting heavily inside her chest. "Why did you help me?" Daniel looked up slowly. Firelight softened the tiredness in his face. "Because storms do not care who people are." She lowered her eyes. "Even after what I did." Daniel leaned back quietly against the chair. People usually act from something deeper. Margaret frowned slightly. What does that mean? He hesitated briefly. Fear, grief, loneliness. The words landed uncomfortably. Too accurately somehow. Margaret wrapped both hands tighter around the mug. You think I am lonely? Daniel gave the smallest shrug. Big house. Empty eyes. The honesty should have irritated her. Instead, it hurt because part of her knew he was right. For years, loneliness followed her quietly through expensive rooms and polished conversations. Since losing her son nearly a decade earlier, nothing really stayed warm for long. Business became distraction. Success became armor. Distance became habit. Yet somehow, sitting beside a fire in a small mountain cabin with a quiet man and a retired military dog made loneliness feel harder to hide. Shadow stirred suddenly then, lifting his head before crossing quietly toward Margaret. Without hesitation, he rested gently beside her chair again. Calm, present, familiar now. Margaret reached down slowly, brushing fingers against warm fur. He keeps doing that, she whispered softly. Daniel watched quietly for a second. Shadow knows grief. She froze slightly. How? Daniel looked back toward the fire. Same way people do. Silence stretched softly between them while snow continued falling outside. Then suddenly, headlights appeared through the front window, slowing near the driveway. Daniel frowned slightly. Too late for visitors. Too early for deliveries. He stood slowly, moving toward the porch window. Margaret noticed something shift in his expression. Not fear. Focus. Quiet awareness. Then came headlights reflecting sharply through snowfall, and a knock against the cabin door that somehow felt heavier than it should have. Sometimes the people carrying the deepest grief recognize it in others long before a single word is spoken. The knock came again, steady beneath the sound of falling snow, while warm firelight flickered softly through Daniel Brooks's cabin. Shadow stood immediately near the door now, alert but calm, posture steady rather than defensive. Daniel moved quietly toward the entrance, one hand resting lightly against the frame before opening it halfway. Outside stood Sheriff Tom Harlan, heavy winter coat dusted with snow, flashlight hanging loosely near one hand. The older man looked relieved almost instantly. There you are, he said with a long exhale. Town has been looking for her for hours. Margaret stood slowly from the fireplace behind Daniel. Sheriff. Tom blinked once in surprise seeing her inside the cabin, safe and warm. Mrs. Whitmore. His shoulders relaxed immediately. Your assistant nearly started a search team. Margaret glanced briefly toward Daniel, something uncomfortable settling quietly inside her chest again. She had not even realized people were searching. Yet somehow the quiet man everyone overlooked had found her first. Shadow sat calmly near Daniel's side while the sheriff stepped inside briefly, removing snow from his coat. Roads are a mess, Tom said. Nobody should be driving tonight. Then his eyes moved toward Daniel with familiar respect. Figures you would be the one helping people again. Margaret noticed the sentence immediately. Again. Daniel shrugged lightly. Just happened to be nearby. Tom laughed softly under his breath. Funny how that keeps happening with you. Margaret frowned slightly. You two know each other well. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. You could say that. Daniel looked mildly uncomfortable already, which somehow made Margaret even more curious. Tom warmed his hands near the fire briefly before continuing casually. Town still talks about that avalanche rescue 6 years back. Daniel sighed quietly. Tom. But the sheriff kept talking gently, not noticing. Middle of a storm worse than this. 3 tourists trapped outside Elk Ridge. Margaret looked toward Daniel immediately. You rescued them? Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. Was nearby. Tom chuckled softly. That is one way to say it. He looked toward Margaret again. Man carried somebody nearly half a mile through waist-deep snow. Daniel clearly wanted the subject dropped. Everybody survived, he said simply. Margaret studied him carefully now. Calm. Quiet. No need for recognition. No stories offered. Nothing about him asked to be admired. Somehow that mattered more. Tom glanced toward the military photograph near the shelf and smiled knowingly. Still keeping life simple after all that service? Margaret looked back toward Daniel. You never said what branch. Daniel leaned slightly against the chair. Quiet for a second too long. Tom answered before he could avoid it. Navy SEAL. Silence followed immediately. Firewood cracked softly inside the fireplace. Snow tapped gently against cabin windows. Margaret blinked once, almost certain she misheard. Navy SEAL. Daniel looked mildly embarrassed now, which somehow surprised her even more. Long time ago. Tom shook his head. Decorated too. Daniel gave him a look somewhere between patience and exhaustion. Tom. All right, the sheriff said with a grin. I will stop. But the room had already changed. Margaret looked toward Daniel differently now. The calmness. The discipline. The way danger never seemed to hurry him. Suddenly everything made sense. Even Shadow. You found me in that storm without hesitation, she said quietly. Daniel shrugged once. Anybody would have. Tom laughed softly. No, Daniel. Anybody would not. Silence settled again while Margaret looked toward the floor briefly. Guilt arrived differently now. He had every reason not to help her. Every reason to stay home after what happened. Yet he came anyway. Quietly. Without anger. Without needing her apology first. Shadow crossed slowly toward Margaret again, resting calmly beside her chair like he understood the room had shifted somehow. She lowered trembling fingers toward warm fur. I judged both of you, she said softly, almost to herself. Daniel remained quiet for a moment, then finally spoke. People usually see what fear tells them to. Something about the sentence hurt more than blame ever could, because fear had shaped so much of Margaret's life. Fear after losing her son. Fear of vulnerability. Fear of needing people. Money simply made walls easier to maintain. Sheriff Tom eventually stood near the door again, preparing to leave before roads worsened further. Snow crews should clear Ridgeview by morning, he said, then paused near Daniel. Veterans fundraiser still happening Saturday? Daniel nodded once. Probably. Tom smiled. Good. Town owes you more support than it gives. After the sheriff left, quiet returned slowly to the cabin. Margaret remained near the fire, watching flames shift softly while something unfamiliar moved quietly inside her chest. Shame maybe, but softer too. Sadder. Why does Shadow keep staying near me? She asked quietly after a while. Daniel glanced toward the shepherd. He notices lonely people. Margaret swallowed hard before looking toward the dark window. Snow still falling outside. The mountains silent beneath winter night. Then, after several long seconds, she whispered something she had not said aloud in years. My son used to love dogs. Daniel looked toward her slowly, saying nothing, just listening. And for the first time in nearly a decade, Margaret Whitmore felt something she thought disappeared forever. The terrifying beginning of finally telling the truth about grief. Morning arrived quietly over Pine Ridge, as though the mountain itself understood some nights leave people changed in ways they cannot immediately explain. Snow still covered the valley below Daniel Brooks's cabin, but the storm had softened into something gentler now. Sunlight resting carefully across pine branches while silence settled warmly against the mountain air. Inside, coffee brewed quietly in the kitchen while Shadow rested near the fireplace. One eye half open as though standing watch remained instinct even in peaceful moments. Margaret Whitmore had barely slept. Not because of discomfort. Because truth had finally arrived somewhere she could no longer ignore it. After years of carefully avoiding grief, pretending success mattered more than loneliness, she found herself sitting awake through most of the night remembering her son. Caleb, 17 years old when illness arrived too suddenly. Bright smile. Quiet heart. Loved dogs with impossible loyalty. For years after losing him, Margaret stopped letting herself feel much at all. Business replaced mourning. Perfection replaced connection. Control became safer than vulnerability. Yet somehow one patient German shepherd resting beside her chair had quietly pulled something broken back into the light. Daniel stood near the kitchen counter when she finally stepped into the living room wrapped in borrowed warmth and hesitation. Coffee, he asked softly. Margaret nodded. Please. The cabin felt different this morning. Less unfamiliar somehow. Shadow stood immediately, crossing toward her with calm certainty before resting gently beside her again. No hesitation now. No fear. Margaret smiled faintly despite herself while brushing one hand softly against warm fur. He really does not give up on people, she whispered. Daniel glanced toward the dog. No, he said quietly. He never did. Snow melted slowly from the porch roof, while morning passed gently between small conversations and comfortable silences. Strange how quickly unfamiliar places sometimes felt safer than familiar ones. Before noon, county trucks finally cleared Ridgeview Pass enough for travel. Margaret stood near the front door adjusting her coat, lingering longer than expected. Something about leaving felt heavier than it should have. Daniel handed her car keys quietly after arranging repairs earlier that morning through a mechanic friend in town. Should run fine now. Margaret looked toward him carefully. Why are you still helping me? Daniel shrugged slightly. Seemed like the right thing. Simple answer. Honest. Somehow harder to forget than anything dramatic ever could be. She hesitated for several seconds before finally speaking again. I made those calls, she admitted quietly. About your contracts. Daniel nodded once. Calm. He already knew. I was angry, she said softly. And wrong. The words came harder than expected. I am sorry. Daniel remained quiet for a second before finally nodding once more. Thank you. No lecture. No guilt. No punishment. Just acceptance. Somehow forgiveness felt heavier than blame. Margaret glanced toward Shadow one last time. Would he? She paused, embarrassed suddenly. Would he mind if I visited? Daniel almost smiled. That depends. She looked uncertain. On what? He glanced toward Shadow. Whether he likes you. The shepherd walked immediately toward Margaret and rested gently against her leg. Daniel laughed quietly for the first time in days. Looks like you were fine. Weeks passed quietly after that. Winter softened slowly across Silver Creek, while something unexpected began changing around town. Margaret Whitmore reinstated Daniel's contracts personally. Quietly. No publicity. No speeches. She also funded a new Veterans Assistance Program through the community center after attending the fundraiser Daniel nearly skipped. There, to her surprise, she learned even more about the quiet man nobody seemed to fully understand. Former Navy SEAL. Decorated service record. Years spent helping veterans quietly after retirement. Yet Daniel never spoke much about any of it. Never seemed interested in admiration. People respected him because kindness followed him naturally, not because recognition did. But perhaps the strangest change happened every Sunday afternoon. Margaret began visiting Pine Ridge with homemade coffee cake she insisted tasted better than store-bought versions. Sometimes she stayed an hour. Sometimes longer. Daniel rarely talked much. Yet silence somehow stopped feeling lonely around people who understood grief. Shadow remained the bridge between them, patient as always, resting wherever sadness lingered longest. One evening near early spring, Margaret stood beside Daniel near the cabin porch overlooking snow finally melting across the valley below. Shadow rested nearby beneath golden sunset light. You know, she said quietly, Caleb would have loved him. Daniel looked toward the dog thoughtfully. I think Shadow would have liked him too. Margaret smiled sadly, though softer now. Less broken somehow. The mountains stretched endlessly before them, while evenings settled gently through pine trees. Healing had not arrived loudly. No miracles. No perfect endings. Just small kindnesses repeated long enough to matter. And perhaps that is how most hearts survive after all. Not through grand moments, but through patient ones. Through unexpected forgiveness. Through quiet people who stay kind even when life gives them every reason not to. Shadow lifted his head then, watching sunset carefully as though satisfied something unfinished had finally found peace. And somewhere beneath the fading winter sky, three lonely souls who once crossed paths through misunderstanding discovered something money, pride, and grief had nearly hidden forever. Sometimes healing arrives wearing muddy boots, carrying old scars, and walking quietly beside a loyal dog that somehow knows exactly where broken hearts still live.